gotta fix that. Okay. Ooh, we gotta fix that. Let's see if we can do something about the camera. The camera. Okay, so there we go. It's a little better, I guess. Medium. Trying to figure out how to get the static out because I don't like narrating with all that noise. Light. Okay. Anyways, let's not get caught up in the tech. We'll figure out the tech later. Get that stand where I want it. Right about there. Get that pop filter where we want it. Bring that. Okay. So the keyboard over here. Put the keyboard over here. I don't know if that's awkward camera positioning. I'm not sure. Where are my mints? I need to wet my mouth. We're going to start with chapter 15 of this book today and see how far we can get. And the mints keep the mouth hydrated so I don't have all the clickies. And they smell nice. They smell so good. Okay. Tech. Okay. Let's see. And with the camera. We are adjusting the camera. Do I want to zoom out? You will not break me. Okay, that's pretty good. See, contrast, saturation, new. Okay. Sharpness. Oi! That's really sharp. And then there's that. Ooh, I like that. There we go. Okay. Mm-hmm. Let's not forget to hit record. Let's bring this all the way over here. Yeah. Chapter 15. Let's see where my reflection is today. Chapter 15. Should I bring it out here? Chapter 15. Ah, there we go. Chapter 15. Secrets Unknown. Secrets Unknown. Sorry, I'll still adjust my screen here. Pop out chat. There we go. And back to reality. Oop, no. Why do we have technical issues today? Oh, my goodness. Oh, boy. Okay. Let's bring that down. We don't need that so huge. Well, what is that? We don't need that in center either. Okay, there we go. Now we're all arranged. Note to self, ignore the rest. Start here. Make some cue markers. Chapter 15. Secrets Unknown. Chapter 15. Secrets Unknown. Secrets Unknown. Secrets Unknown. Nope. Secrets Unknown. The several days Mazden had predicted for their trip to the central maze of the labyrinth had turned into more than a week. The several days, oops, dang. The several days Mazden had predicted for their trip to the central maze of the labyrinth. Dang it. Okay. Sa. Sa. No, but for really real, start here. Ignore everything else. Chapter 15. Secrets Unknown. The several days Mazden had predicted for their trip to the central maze of the labyrinth. The several days Mazden had predicted for their trip to the central maze of the labyrinth had turned into more than a week. Eliard's conjured food grew tasteless, and their days were a constant cycle of slow progress, checking for pits and other traps at all intervals. Eliard's conjured food Eliard's conjured food grew tasteless, and their days were a constant cycle of slow process. And their days were a constant cycle of slow progress. Damn it. I am so good at this. Eliard's conjured food grew tasteless, and their days were a constant cycle of slow progress, checking for pits and other traps at all reasonable intervals. Okay, we're going to add an and there. I think that's what he wanted. Eliard's conjured food grew tasteless, and their days were a constant cycle of slow progress and checking for pits and other traps at all reasonable intervals. Eliard's fear had grown after they discovered the third trap in less than half a day after their initial finding. This led to a paranoia which only deepened over time. "We should check again," he would say. Forget that Rolf wanted to save at least a thread of his minuscule pool of power to speak with Gertrude in an emergency. He reckoned it slowed their travel to a crawl and would delay them for weeks. He reckoned it slowed their travel to a crawl and would delay them for weeks if he let Eliard have his way. Unless you've suddenly sprouted the ability to check yourself, Fern's staff is going to have to do, for the most part. And on they went. And on they went, Rolf tapping ahead and to the sides like a blind beggar in an alley. He only used his new spell when he felt it was worth the risk, like when they found themselves in a relatively narrow passageway. He only used his new spell when he felt it was worth the risk, like when they found themselves in a relatively narrow passageway between rock faces. It paid off, however, and that was when they found the first of the acid traps. He triggered the trap with the staff and managed to only lose a strap on his pack when the angry liquid splashed onto it. The complexity of the traps had increased over time, and eventually they were avoiding falling rocks along with the original pitfall style traps. The pair lost 2 days of travel to recover from their first encounter with the poison gas trap. The pair lost 2 days of travel to recover from their first encounter with a poison gas trap, which, with repeated healing from Iliard hastening the process, Rolf's lungs still itched when he thought about it. Rolf wiped his brow as they crested a slight rise in the path. Ahead of them rose a large stone arch, marking the entrance to the maze. Crone's beard. It's about time. That's not the one. Crone's beard. It's about time. There we go. His relief turned to apprehension as they continued forward. The distance was deceptive, and by the time they reached the finely crafted arch, it towered. The distance was deceptive, and by the time they reached the finely crafted arch, it towered above even Gertrude's head. The design departed significantly from the rest of the labyrinth. The design departed significantly from the rest of the labyrinth they'd traversed thus far. Where they had tread was cavernous and rough, like a naturally formed set of caverns, even though they went on for miles. These enormous stones had been dressed and fitted by a master or a god. Iliard gave a low whistle. Rolf touched the smooth stone with his calloused palm. Why do you think it's so big? Iliard gestured to Gertrude, who stood in the middle of the arch, which framed her like a human standing in a normal doorway. Makes me worry about what the triads placed in here. Makes me worry about what the triads placed in there, if the ceiling needs to be so high. The map in Rolf's hand ended where they stood, the gate drawn as a simple pictogram. He tucked it into his pack in case they needed it for a return trip. He had no reason not to trust the folks of Shulza, but that didn't mean they would be successful in their venture against the Guardian here. Should they need to retreat, he wanted some kind of visual guide. Should they need to retreat, he wanted some kind of visual guide. Blah. Blah. Should they need to retreat, he wanted some guide. Some guide. Should they need to retreat, he wanted some kind of visual to guide them back to a safe area to recuperate a second time. Damn it. Should they need to retreat, he wanted some kind of visual to guide them back to a safe area to recuperate a second time. Torches lined the walls of the entry corridor of the maze, seemingly unaffected by fuel consumption. Dang it. Torches lined the walls of the entry corridor of the maze, seemingly unaffected by fuel consumption, as they each appeared to be brand new to Rolf's eyes. Despite the effort to conserve his magic, he chanced a detection spell before stepping foot into the maze proper. The green glow suffused the area and then dissipated, which meant there was nothing to worry about, or at least nothing the spell could detect, but it hadn't failed him yet. "Let's go," he said, and strode into the long corridor. They went about 200 paces before a sharp fork in the hallway revealed itself. Nothing stood at the end, waiting for them. Nothing stood at the end waiting for them, despite Rolf's imagination assuming there would be some kind of armored warrior blocking their path. "Too many bedtime stories," he grumbled to him. "Too many bedtime stories," he grumbled to himself as they approached the decision point. Rolf examined their choices, and the right-hand corridor looked much like the left, with nothing differentiating the two besides the direction. He tapped at the floor of each with Fern's staff, but that yielded no insight. He tapped at the floor of each with Fern's staff, but that yielded no insight. Excuse me. With a shrug, Rolf turned to the left and raised a boot to take the first step when Eliard's hand came to rest on his shoulder. The light touch froze him in place with his foot midair. Remember, Eliard said. "This is going to be different from what we've faced so far." "Remember," Eliard said, "this is going to be different from what we've faced so far." Rolf let his foot down. Rolf let his foot down when he realized he stood like a statue, waiting for something terrible to happen. He cleared his throat and turned to the man. "Different than slogging through unending traps and caverns?" "Very." Rolf stared at Eliard, waiting for more of an explanation. Eliard let his breath out in a huff. "Don't you remember anything I tell you? This is where the treasures of the level is stored. This is where the treasure of the level is stored and protected. It's not only wandering monsters anymore." Yes, the Guardian. "Not only that," Eliard cut in, "there will be monsters placed specifically to guard the approach to the Guardian. More traps, you name it." "Is that going to influence which direction I choose?" Rolf asked, but trailed off as a blur of motion behind Eliard caught his eye. He peered around the cleric to search for what it had been, but the way was clear. Eliard moved to intercept Rolf's gaze. "What is it?" "Something fast moving through that passage." He motioned to indicate the right-hand corridor, which had been behind Eliard during his last admonition. Eliard whipped around and looked for himself, but appeared to come up as empty-handed as Rolf had. "I guess we should go the other way, then. We leave whatever it was at our backs. We leave whatever it was to our backs, but it might be worth the risk if we avoid it." Rolf looked at Gertrude, who stared off into the distance, not paying attention to either of them. No help was going to come from her, but Rolf also didn't want to use the last of his magic for the day just to get her opinion. He nodded and turned once again to the passageway to the left. His hopes for a smooth trip were dashed as soon as they had gone another few hundred paces. They came upon another fork, this time continuing straight and to the right. Rolf's mind spun, trying to orient their direction compared to how they had entered the central labyrinth, and he knew they would be lost in an instant. Eliard, you've done this central maze before, right? The other man stood with his hands on his hips, examining the new path. Sure, why? How did you keep from being turned around? My head is already spinning, How did you keep from being turned around? My head is already spinning, trying to decide which direction leads farther inward. Oh, we had Skarn, Eliard said in an offhand manner. Skarn again, Rolf spat under his breath. What was that? Nothing. Rolf cleared his throat and checked his tone, giving Eliard a hard time for relying on the party's pathfinder was like blaming water for being wet. Assume we don't have a pathfinder. What do delving parties do without one do? Well, what did delving parties without one do? Oh, Eliard took his pack off and fished around until he came away with a large piece of chalk. We still marked the way in case Skarn was having an off day and we needed to backtrack. Without a pathfinder, it's one of the easiest ways to know where you've been. Eliard demonstrated by marking the wall to their left before the fork. Left hand says it's the path you took to enter, so you keep it on your right to get out. The practice agreed with the practical part of Rolf's brain. Right or straight, then? If I'm thinking about this correctly, turning here leads into the maze. If I'm thinking about this correctly, turning here heads into the maze. Rolf had no reason to object, so he turned and made his way in that direction. Eliard marked the stone on their left as they went. The first few turns took minutes of deliberation, but eventually they gave up on agonizing over each choice and quickly chose the path they deemed most likely to lead deeper into the maze. Rolf couldn't decide if they were actually making progress, but counted forward momentum as something. Rolf couldn't decide if they were actually making progress, but counted forward momentum as something. His successful encounter with the cave crawler, despite nearly losing his hand over it, had boosted his confidence in his ability to handle dangerous situations. He mused on whether that was either earned or wise, but had no answer to the question. More than one dead end caused them to retrace their steps, adding to the overall confusion, but proving Eliard's chalking method. The cleric had earned some new respect in Rolf's eyes. The cleric had earned some new respect in Rolf's eyes, and Rolf was forced to remember that despite being a coward, he had survived 94 levels of the labyrinth before their party finally decided to call it quits. Rolf trusted Eliard's sense of direction more than his own, so took the next turn as the other man chose, then nearly collided with him as he froze mid-stride. "Mother above! Eliard!" Ralph complained. "Don't just stop!" Eliard hushed him sharply. "I will not." "Shut up, Rolf," Eliard said, and the quaver in his voice. "Shut up, Rolf," Eliard said, and the quaver in his voice stopped Rolf's next line of inquiry. Eliard said, and the quaver in his voice stopped Eliard's next line of inquiry. Gertrude let out a low growl, her hot breath steaming the back of Rolf's neck. Rolf leaned around the man's bulky pack to get a glimpse of whatever had spooked him, and his stomach dropped, standing at the other. Standing at another dead end was a minotaur. If it had been anything like the first minotaur Rolf had inadvertently defeated, he might not have had such a visceral reaction. But this one was not the same. The minotaur easily stood a head taller than the first he had met, and unlike the original, this one wore a metal cuirass. On its broad torso. Its lower half was mostly bare, outside of a rugged pair of trousers which cut off above the calf. It stood with its hands at rest on the butt of a long battle axe handle. The wicked, double-bladed head of the monstrosity sitting on the ground. "Back up," Eliard whispered, and stepped back with one boot. Rolf attempted to comply, but came up short against Gertrude's massive foot, which sat directly behind him. She let out a grumpy noise and didn't budge. Rolf closed his eyes momentarily and cursed, then cast the last of his spells for the day. "Back up, Gertrude," he whispered to the dinosaur. "What worries you, tiny dinosaur?" Her voice, despite the fact that Rolf could tell she had tried to emulate his cautious tone, was still louder than a man talking at full volume in a busy tavern. Rolf winced. "Who dares trespass in Lanath's domain?" A confident voice boomed from the end of the corridor. "They can talk?" Rolf asked. "Some can," Eliard confirmed. Maybe we can reason with it?" "Stand and face me, children of men. I am your downfall, and this maze shall be your tomb." The Minotaur swung the axe up over one shoulder in emphasis. "Why do you fear this one?" Gertrude asked, genuine surprise in her reptilian tone. Why? He's massive. Rolf realized he was complaining to a giant carnivore about something less than half its size. Can you do something about him? You cannot? Very well. Stand behind me. Don't have to tell me twice, Rolf said. Then to Eliard, get behind her. Don't have to tell me twice, Rolf said. Then to Eliard, get behind her. Get behind her. The pair swiftly moved to the rear of the T-Rex. The pair swiftly moved to the wheel of the T-Rex. The pair swiftly moved to the rear of the T-Rex, accompanied by a cry from the Minotaur. Cowards! He unshouldered the axe and advanced on them. Gertrude stepped forward once and closed half the distance in her long stride. This appeared to confuse the Minotaur, who halted his approach. He seemed to recognize Gertrude and glared at her. You serve Lenath here, beast! Aid me in! Aid me in! Aid me in! His demand was cut short as Gertrude's maw closed over his upper half, swallowing the Minotaur to the bottom of his cuirass. Blood and viscera sprayed out over her teeth and fell to the ground. She lifted the struggling body of the Minotaur. She lifted the struggling body of the monster and whipped it back and forth like a cat snapping the neck of a rodent. Red mist showered Rolf, and his stomach churned uncomfortably. Gertrude opened her mouth mid-swing and flung the now limp form against the wall, forming the dead end. It landed with a sickening crunch and crash of metal, then slumped to the floor, motionless. Rolf felt a familiar warmth spread through his body, though it was weaker than the times he had struck a blow against the creature he faced. Whether or not the Triad had recognized Gertrude as a member of their party, he and Eliard must be reaping some of the rewards from their efforts. Crone's beard, Eliard said, his tone full of awe. Glancing over at Eliard, Rolf saw a new respect in his eyes as he watched Gertrude snuffle at the body. She daintily picked the lower half up in her front teeth. Rolf watched in horror as she chewed through his abdomen, leaving the armored top half on the ground. The crunch of bones and sinew accompanied her chewing, and Rolf leaned over to the side to be sick. She snaked her head around with concern in her eyes, despite the blood and offal clinging to her lips. She snaked her head around with concern in her eyes, despite the blood and offal clinging to her lips. Rolf waved her back to make her makeshift meal. Stumbling a few feet away. If Rolf had needed a reminder that he had made a pact with a If Rolf had needed a reminder that he had made a pact with an enormous killing machine, there it was. At least she's on our side, he thought, as he brought up the remnants of the last meal he'd eaten. Perhaps the one before that as well. At least she's on our side, he thought, as he brought up the remnants of the last meal he'd eaten, perhaps the one before that as well. Mm-hmm. 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 All right, I'm going to go take a quick vocal break because that's what we got to do. We got to preserve the tools. And I'll be back in about 5. We're going to stop the recording. Here we go. Yep. Beep dip dip boop doop doop boop. Oh, yeah, kid. Wanna be my love? Close at the door. It's so quiet in here. Ooh, I should have gone to pee. I'll be back. I'm going to go pee. Yeah, wow. Okay. We're going to do some social media for a moment. For a moment. Hi, folks. If you ever wondered what live narration looks like, come see me on YouTube. Bash Voices and Crafts. All right. See you there. Goodbye. I love you. All right. Let's see if my compy can handle streaming via TikTok as well as YouTube. As well as YouTube. TikTok Live. TikTok. Yes, it can. Okay. No sound detected. No sound detected. Wait. Scarlet. Scarlet. 2i2. There we go. MacBook Pro microphone. Nope. Scarlet 2i2. All right. So now we've got that. We'll put that there. And we'll put that there. I'm arranging the socials, dude. Hello. What was that? What was that? What was that? Hello. All right. Now, moving on. Now that we got all the bitches up, I have a notification. Notification center. Reach more. Blah, blah, blah. I'm not paying you, TikTok. So you can suck on that business. No, thank you. thing. Ba 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 ba. Beep 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 beep. Chapter 16. Da 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 da. Ooh, I hear the notifications going off. Hold on. Hello, Apple user. Nope. It's probably Facebook. Whatevs. Anywho, let's get back to the recording position. Let's get our mint. I don't know where my mouth spray went. It probably fell somewhere over there. So we're going to use a mint instead. Because I take ADHD meds, so my freaking stuff is clicky because my mouth is dry. Because ADHD dries out your mouth at every corner. Every corner. You like my Nomi? Okay. Chapter 16. We kind of needed that. Gertrude finished her Minotaur snack relatively quickly, wiping her snout on the wall with loud scrapes until it was cleaned to her satisfaction. The queasiness in Rolf's gut, however, persisted as they backtracked to the next reasonable turn. The queasiness in Rolf's gut, however, persisted as they backtracked to the next reasonable turn. Eliard had no such compunctions about Gertrude's diet, it seemed, and he frequently glanced back at the dinosaur with approval. Perhaps he was simply happy to have a giant carnivore protecting him, given the challenges the maze had started to throw at them. The next turn seemed to take them in the wrong direction, which made Rolf curse. That's the problem with the labyrinth, Eliard said with a sage tone. Sometimes the path that seems to go the wrong way is actually the right one. Your wisdom isn't particularly encouraging, Rolf complained. It's not meant to be. I'm a realist, partly why I've always been a coward, I suppose. They went on without speaking for a while, Rolf contented to let Eliard lead the way. Eventually, they grew tired, and Rolf considered setting up camp. Exhaustion was the only real measure of time in the labyrinth, with no sun to speak of. Instead of sleeping in the open, they decided to pitch camp at an inconvenient dead end they had found 2 turns prior. Better to have something solid at their back, in one direction, at least. Eliard set out their stew pot to turn his conjured rations into something more palatable than the magic allowed. Eliard set out their stew pot to turn his conjured rations into something more palatable than the magic allowed. Rolf's spells had run dry after their encounter with the Minotaur, the thought of which still made his stomach churn. With hand gestures and not a few muttered curses, Rolf convinced Gertrude to lay across the passageway. Her bulk effectively sealed them off from the rest of the maze, if imperfectly. A small fire crackled merrily in the stone. A small fire crackled merrily on the stone, and the smoke drifted lazily into the high ceiling. No fire pit was needed in a place like this, and there must have been some kind of natural air currents because the air remained clear around them. Given the enclosed nature of the maze, they assumed their fire wasn't likely to draw attention and agreed. They assumed their fire wasn't likely to draw attention and agreed a hot meal was worth the minuscule risk. An hour later, Rolf and Eliard sat with their legs stretched out in front of them, bowls of makeshift stew resting empty on the floor by their feet. Rolf had never been one for a pipe, but suddenly longed for the simple comfort of one. He recalled his father sitting by the hearth, smoking one after a family meal, and his eyes clouded over with the memory. What I wouldn't give to have that again, he thought, then turned to Eliard. What will you do if we manage to get out of here? What will you do if you What will you do if we manage to get out of here? Never set foot in Never set foot in a labyrinth again. Never set foot in the labyrinth again. Triad take me if I'm a liar. Never set foot in a labyrinth again. Triad take me if I'm a liar. Rolf gave a hearty chuckle. I'll join you in that oath. I was thinking about my father. I spent so much time feeling like I could never live up to his legacy. I spent so much time feeling like I could never live up to his legacy. Now I just want to sit by the fire with him. I don't have to deal with that kind of pressure. No father to prove yourself to? Nah, mine's dead, Eliard said. Rolf goggled at how casual Eliard was about it. And it must have shown on his face. Nah, it's been years. You're lucky, him still being above the dirt. Anyway, what do you mean? I saw you splitting stone clean as could be to make all those improvements for the lizard folk. That, Rolf scoffed. My father would have eaten that job for breakfast and then built a castle for lunch. He'd look at those gates and see every flaw, of which there were plenty, I assure you. Eliard shrugged. The people of Shulza seem to like them fine. To answer your question, maybe I'll apprentice to be a stonemason. If you can do it, I stand a good chance. Eliard winked at Rolf, which made him laugh. You're maudlin when you haven't slept, Rolf. Get over and get yourself some rest. Rolf decided the man wasn't wrong and laid his bedroll out on the hard ground. The pair went about the small chores of shutting the camp down for the night, banking the coals, and deciding against setting a watch with Gertrude filling the space between them and potential threats. Rolf still had his hammer in hand next to his bedding because, at this point, he liked to believe he wasn't that much of an idiot. He lay with his hands intertwined behind his head and sighed, staring at the distant ceiling. Where am I? I lost it. He lay with his hands intertwined behind his head and sighed, staring at the ceiling beyond the reach of the dim glow of the torches that still lined the walls. You know, he said to the silent air, you're not as bad as I thought, Eliard. For a coward. Eliard gave a rueful laugh. And you're not so bad either, Rolf. For a fool. They shared a final chuckle before lapsing into the quiet of their self-imposed. They shared a. My mouth is getting tangled. They shared a final chuckle before lapsing into the quiet of their self-imposed night. Sleep came, followed quickly by morning, with sleep came, followed quickly by morning, when the pair stirred and woke Gertrude with their shuffling. When the pair stirred and woke Gertrude with their shuffling, she sat up and leaned against a wall with a sigh, clearly disappointed at having been disturbed. Rolf managed to rekindle a small fire to cook some of the remaining oats they had scavenged from the Delvers' packs. The people of Shelza had kept them fed for the duration and sent them with provisions aside, but the muzzy-headed feeling in Rolf's head called for porridge. Eliard grunted his approval as he came to sit by Rolf and wait for the grains to cook. He yawned and lifted his hands above his head, then paused at the apex of his stretch. Something's wrong. Rolf stirred the gruel absent-mindedly. What is? Eliard gestured at the passage beyond Gertrude. We'd backtracked before resting for the night, yes? Don't be stupid. Of course we did. Then why, Eliard asked, is our mark gone? What do you mean? It's not. Rolf blinked heavily and rubbed a speck of dirt from the corner of his eye. Mother's curse. It is gone. Porridge set to the side and forgotten, Rolf and Eliard went to examine the nearby junction where they had turned to rest. There had been one of the cleric's telltale X's on the far wall, the left-hand side in the direction they had gone out in. Now, there was nothing but smooth, unblemished stone. Gertrude swiped her tongue at the forgotten porridge, either not paying attention to their current predicament or not caring. Rolf stepped into the tunnel, eyes searching for any of their other marks. The walls were blank. How much do you remember? Rolf asked. How much do you remember? Rolf asked Eliard. The cleric tapped his lips, obviously deep in thought. I think I remember the last 3. Let's go, Rolf said, turning back into their camp. We'll see how many are missing. Maybe it's a fluke. Eliard winced. But what could have wiped it off? Rolf shook his head, stuffing bedrolls into rucksacks and pulling the bowl Gertrude had licked clean from her grasp. She growled at him, but let the offense pass. She growled at him, but let the offense pass. How would I know? You're the adventurer. He hated the way his tone whined like a child's. It didn't help when Eliard didn't answer him. The three of them set off down the tunnel system, Eliard leading the way. There was a worried part of Rolf that wondered if he should go ahead and make sure there weren't traps afoot, and for a time, there wasn't a reason for it. Eliard remembered the next three arrows. And then they found all of the when they found all of the markings wiped away, the need to check for traps became a necessity. What in all three names? Eliard breathed when they backtracked to what should have been the fourth. Gertrude grunted and swung her snout to the left. Rolf followed her gaze and found a familiar white chalk marking on the northern wall. Rolf breathed a sigh of relief. Looks like your memory isn't as keen as you thought, cleric. Eliard pursed his lips, his eyes squinting at the familiar marking. I guess it isn't, he muttered. Rolf ignored the disbelief in his voice. Just let's proceed carefully. Just let's proceed carefully. Rolf shrugged. Didn't hurt anyone to test for traps as they went, even if he believed the cleric to be paranoid. Rolf shrugged. Didn't hurt anyone to test for traps as they went, even if he believed the cleric to be paranoid. The three of them followed the next few markings, and an uncomfortable sensation began to trickle up Rolf's spine. Their surroundings didn't feel familiar the further they followed the arrows through the tunnels. It wasn't until they came to a particular stone outcropping that Eliard stopped cold in his steps. I don't remember this, he told Rolf sternly. I don't remember this, he told Rolf sternly. Pride bubbled darkly in Rolf's chest. He wanted to refute the cleric's observation. Surely they must have come this way. After all, that was his chalk. But the certainty in his voice gave him pause. What is the alternative? Rolf asked, echoing the question he had asked when they broke camp. Eliard shook his head. I genuinely don't know, but we did not come this way. He tapped the stone. I would have remembered. Why is that? The outcropping had a particular arm shape, but was otherwise unremarkable to his gaze. Because it looks like Halmhire the Wicked. Eliard cocked an eyebrow at Rolf. The druid turned his incredulous gaze to the outcropping. The cartoon? He asked in bewilderment. he asked in bewilderment. The very one. My kids read them, or did. Eliard's eyes took on a faraway look, and Rolf politely turned his gaze away toward Gertrude. He threaded magic through the air, allowing them to talk. Supperling, this is not where we were, she huffed. Supperling, this is not where we were, she huffed. I'm gathering that. Rolf swiped a hand over his scalp. Do you know who or what could have done this? I do not know what to call them. They are small things, not very tasty, she grumbled. Very quick, too. I do not know what to call them. They are small things, not very tasty, she grumbled. Very quick, too. Rolf relayed this information to Eliard, who took a long moment to consider. Excuse me. Rolf relayed this information to Eliard, who took a long moment to consider. Miscreants. They're like goblins, but smarter. But if that was the case, we would see an occasional burrow along the wall. They're crafty. They're crafty, but they mostly hide away. Gertrude huffed when Rolf translated. Then I would not know. There was an edge to her voice that suggested she didn't appreciate the second guessing. She swung her head back and marched forward. Maybe we will come. A great cracking sound split the air, and the huge monster froze. The floor beneath Gertrude caved beneath her great weight with a large crash and a surprised roar. Dust kicked up in the air in a plume around her as Rolf and Eliard darted forward. The pitfall trap was just large and deep enough that it had. The pitfall trap was just large and deep enough that it had only swallowed one of her thighs. However, she had braced her weight wrong and pitched into the side of the trap. Are you okay? Rolf asked as the air cleared. No, Gertrude roared, trying to wiggle her body one way and another to try and extract herself from the hole. It was also the last thing he could make out before the magic slipped away from him. Rolf pulled rope from his rucksack and threw one end of it to Eliard. Think we can rig a harness for her, pull her out? Eliard looked from their rope to the dinosaur. I sincerely doubt it, but we can try. Another roar thundered through Gertrude's chest, making the ground beneath her feet tremble. Let's do it fast, then. They threw ropes over the dinosaur's body, trying to secure it beneath her limbs. Rolf's great idea was that if they could just get it tied around her torso, they could somehow haul her up enough to where she could find purchase in her scrambling. Instead, she caught the ropes between her teeth and tore through them, wriggling out from the tie that Eliard had attempted. Rolf wanted to speak to her, to calm her down, but between the traps and this last conversation, his magic had run dry already. We're trying to help you, Rolf grumbled, trying to catch the rope to tie it back in place. When Gertrude's large maw snapped at him, it was a surprise, at least to Rolf, who had suddenly been displaced from the air her teeth sheared through. Eliard had grasped him around the middle and lifted him, pulling him out of her reach. What do you think you're doing? Let's try that again. What do you think you're doing? Rolf stared in disbelief at the struggling dinosaur. I mean, we're friends. At least he thought. At least he thought they were. I figured. Friends? Are you insane? She's still a monster stuck in a hole. Eliard scowled at him. She doesn't see anyone. She's panicking. Gertrude roared again, trying to squeeze out of the hole and failing, and settled her jaw on the stone floor of the tunnel with a whimper. What should we do? Rolf asked. Eliard shook his head. Not much at this point. Let's see if we can get out from here. Let's see if we can get out from here. We'll have to come back for her. Rolf hated the idea. Eliard had been dependable up to this point for the three of them, but without Gertrude's help, could they even make it back to Schulze for help? But without Gertrude's help, could they even make it back to Schulze for help? Would she be okay on her own, like Eliard said? Look, it isn't unusual for monsters to get stuck in pitfall traps like this. Once she calms down, she'll be able to get out on her own. She's smart. She may be out. She's smart. She may be out before we come back for her. And you saw how she almost got you. The beast can protect herself. Rolf hesitated. Gertrude had been his companion since the beginning. She was his savior. Beyond that, she was the reason they were even down here this far. Will she be all right? No time to worry about that right now. We have to go before her wailing brings... No time to worry about that right now. We have to go before her wailing brings every monster in the vicinity down on us. Rolf nodded, if a bit uncertainly, and moved back. Through the passage with Eliard. He glanced back over his shoulder one last time to find Gertrude still flailing against the trap. I'm sorry, he murmured, as they rounded the corner toward what he hoped was the exit. I'll come back for you. Rolf's eyes stung with unshed tears, and he hoped his promise wasn't an empty one. First, he had to survive. All right, time for a vocal breaky. We'll go ahead and that's an hour. So we'll go ahead and save this file. Save. That way that file doesn't get too large. That's what she said. And that's session 8 file. Open. Nope, that's the wrong one. That's the wrong one. Ooh, maybe I need a snack. Okay, now we have a fresh template for when I come back. Okay, I'm going to take a little vocal break, refill up on some water. Hi, JJ. Readjust my Nomi. This guy stands on business. Mm-hmm. All right, I'll be right back. A few minutes, couple of minutes. Minutes. All right. Oh, got the water. Got the stuff. Mm-hmm. Freaking barking ass dogs. How long have I been doing this for? Hour and a half. Okay. I'm going to do this chapter, and then I'm going to call it quits for now because I got to get ready for my daytime job to go do some stuff. So, interlude. Gertrude. Pain was the first thing that pierced Gertrude's surprise when the very floor betrayed her. Well, that and the sound. Well, that and some of the metal spikes littering the pit she had half fallen into. She screamed and flailed, digging the barbs deeper, but the agony only intensified her rage. But the agony only intensified her rage. The strange, tiny dinosaur who had promised her freedom stood with outstretched hands as if his puny arms could help her. She snarled and snapped, frantic and uncaring of the damage she might inflict. The other one, who had always stank of fear, pulled her supperling away, shouting words she couldn't understand. The small one hesitated, but Gertrude's focus was on the pins and gouging holes. The other one, who always stank of fear, pulled her supperling away, shouting words she couldn't understand. The small one hesitated, but Gertrude's focus was on the pins gouging holes in her scales, her blood seeping out around her to the stones beneath. Her struggles grew less frequent and weaker, and when she calmed again, the pair were gone. She was alone. Again. No, not truly. The malicious little creatures who they had asked about, the clever, fast morsel that she had never tasted in all her time in the labyrinth, stood below the level of the broken floor, a small corridor leading out of the pit to a destination unknown. Much too small for her, but then again, this part of the labyrinth was never for her. It laughed in the darkness, eyes reflecting what little light there was. She growled, but nothing in its posture changed as it watched her. It wasn't afraid of her, having fallen into its trap. She sighed and shifted, activating the bright points stinging her side. She sighed and shifted, activating the bright points stinging her side. Maybe the goddess punished her, though that existential thought was almost beyond her Blah! Maybe the goddess punished her, though that existential thought was almost beyond her abilities to consider. She had no mate, no children, nothing but the endless cycle of guarding the gate. The not dinner who had promised to take her from this place had been the first living thing she had protected in her entire existence. If she if she understood irony, she might have hissed a lizard's laugh. If she understood irony, she might have hissed a lizard's laugh. As her muscles gave out and she laid her head against the wall of the pit, she recognized this wasn't the worst pain she'd endured in her years. Gertrude would simply have to wait and eventually be reborn again into the cycle of death that was her existence. She closed her eyes, a wet bubble of blood bursting from her nose as she struggled to breathe. Freedom had been a nice dream. Freedom had been a nice dream, at least for a while. At least for a while. Okay. All right, folks. So we're going to go ahead and end the stream here. I'm going to get ready for my other job. And thanks for watching. Okay, bye.